Greetings sailors and welcome to my first look at the upcoming Tier 6 premium cruiser, the Admiral Graf Spee. This is the first representation, I suppose is the best way to put it, we have in-game of the Deutschland-class heavy cruisers, or as the British terms them, pocket battleships, and that all comes down to having fairly big guns for a cruiser. But it is still basically a cruiser, so that's how you have to think about this thing. Don't be fooled into thinking it's a miniature battleship, even with those big guns. The nature of the Graf Spee and the Deutschland class generally makes them a bit of an awkward fit in warships terms, because it's not like they're very, very well armoured, even for a cruiser. Even at Tier 6. There are cruisers that have overall better armour protection. I mean, the Cleveland beats this thing for armour protection. So it doesn't stand out in that way. It does, of course, have those 11-inch guns, which is what the Scharnhorst has. But it's still awkward because you've only got 2 turrets, and it's a fore and aft turret arrangement. So because you've got those bigger guns with a longer reload, that also is a bit of an awkward fit. And I actually speculated myself way back in the day that this thing might appear as a low-tier battleship. But now, looking at the armour, as we can do in warships these days, I realise it wouldn't even really fit as, you know, a Tier 3 or a Tier 4 battleship. It just wouldn't work as well. So what Wargaming have done is they've made it a Tier 6 cruiser. And I'm still not convinced, like, at Tier 6, that it maybe works that tier, especially as it doesn't up tier particularly well. This is, I'm going to say right off the bat, one of the big issues this ship has is it does not do nearly so well in Tier 8 games. And you can say that of other Tier 6 cruisers as well. I mean, particularly the Nuremberg maybe copes a bit less well, but that's actually got a better range than this, but we'll come to that. It's just overall, it's not a ship that's going to maybe have mass appeal. And even if it sells well, I suspect for a lot of people it will be something that just sits in their port and that they'll want to buy it because it's a famous ship, rather than they want to buy it because it looks really amazing and it looks really powerful. It's awkward, and it's a lot of work to get it to do what you want it to do. And it can produce good results, but you're going to have to work for it. And I think that's my key kind of takeaway from having tested the Graf Spee, is this is not an easy ship. It's a ship that will challenge you, and you'll have to adapt to it rather than making it adapt to you. So I'm going to do what I usually do and run down the stats. I've got 2 bits of gameplay for you. This top tier game, where I was with Strangers123, who's actually in a German destroyer there, which I am allowed to show you this footage now at this point. And also, there's a Tier 8 game coming up after this. But obviously, as I'll be more covering the stats, I won't be so much talking about the gameplay, at least at first. So, hit points. You have 39,400. This is by far the most of any Tier 6. It's a good couple of thousand over what the Cleveland has, which is the next best at this tier. So you have a lot of health, and you have it for a reason. That's because it's fairly squishy. And if I can briefly touch on the armour, and I will do a section at the end where I go over the armour viewer in more detail. But basically, it's cruiser armour. You do have 100mm of protection on the central belt, but overall, you're pretty squishy, and what you don't have is that turtle back that the battleships have. So anything of battleship caliber that shoots at you, it's probably going to do substantial damage, just like most of the other Tier 6 cruisers. It's not really remarkable in that regard. This game, by the way, yes, there was another Graf Spee on the enemy team. There was a little bit of banter, because this is, I think, one of the other testers. Well, it must be one of the other super testers. So, yeah, the armour's nothing special. Don't particularly rely on the armour. It might serve you better against other cruisers, but at this tier, you're going to be meeting a lot more people with fast-firing HE spam guns. So even if you might bounce those 6-inch AP shells, if you're angled correctly, they might then just switch to AP and set you on fire. That is more than possible and probably will happen. There is one thing that's really good about this, though, that actually is outstandingly good, in fact, I think it's fair to say. It has got some fairly substantial torpedo bulges. And again, I'll point this out in the armor viewer exactly how much of the ship that they cover. But basically, it's most of the center section of the ship is covered by a torpedo bulge, which gives you a whopping 22% protection. There are battleships that would kill for that. There are quite a lot of high-tier battleships that have torpedo damage mitigation in the single digits. This has got 22%. That's rather substantial. So it means that for those mid-tier torpedoes, which don't do as much damage as you're facing at tier 9 and 10, you can take maybe 1 or 2 more than you would be able to otherwise, just because of your hit points pool and because of that substantial torpedo bulge. So that's one unalloyed excellent thing about this ship. You know, the torpedo bulge protection really is fantastic. Onto the guns, which are probably the most kind of recognizable feature. I don't know how to put that exactly, but they're the thing that maybe stands out the most about this ship is the fact that it's this relatively squashy cruiser, but with very big guns. Well, there's an upside to that and a downside to that. Okay, you've got 11-inch guns. This is what the Scharnhorst has. Fantastic. These are very big guns. And when they hit properly, they hit hard. But they come with a penalty. So, first off, you've only got 2 turrets, 3 guns each, which is not so bad. You know, 6 guns at this tier is not, like, excessively bad. But if you want to get all of them on target, you are going to have to expose more of your ship than you would in, say, I don't know, a Cleveland or something. So that sometimes can feel a bit hampering. Like, you might struggle to get sufficient firepower on your target. Sometimes you're going to have to stay at an angle and you're only going to have the front or rear turret available, at which point doing substantial amounts of damage becomes quite tricky because you don't have that much firepower available. Along with these big guns comes a big reload. 20 seconds, which is, of course, by far the worst at tier 6. In some regards, it could be argued it feels like a gimped tier, not tier 8 cruiser, it feels like a gimped 8-inch gunned cruiser. Because the Aoba has got 8-inch guns, which fire every 11 seconds. So it's not quite half. And you've got more of those guns available. So, yeah, sometimes that firepower arrangement and the reload is going to kick your butt a bit. Especially, and in this particular scenario, you know, I was chasing after a destroyer there. It worked out for me. I was able to get some hits in and actually hit him blind in the smoke. But there are times when it's going to make dealing with these destroyers especially very tricky because you just cannot fire at them fast enough. In that regards, it can feel like when you're playing a battleship and you've got a destroyer at close range and suddenly you're relying on your slow-loading battleship guns to take them out, and it becomes a bit more problematic. The accuracy is also pretty poor. It's 182 meters dispersion at a maximum of 16 kilometers range. So, yeah, and you don't get a spotter plane for this ship. You only get the catapult fighter. So that's 16 kilometers. While it's pretty good for a tier 6 cruiser, it's not the best by any means. And you couple that with the rather inaccurate firepower, it can be a variable experience. Let's put it that way. This is, of course, a better figure than, say, the Scharnhorst gets. They haven't given it quite battleship levels of accuracy, but it's still pretty bad for a cruiser. The one thing that is actually pretty good. In fact, that's above average for its tier, is the turret traverse rate. So you're never going to struggle that much compared to your contemporaries for keeping your turrets on target. It's a flat 25 seconds, and you compare that to the Leander, which gets 25.7, the Cleveland gets 32, almost 33, the Alba has 36 with smaller guns, Budione is also exactly 25, Nuremberg gets just under 24, and I think the Molotov is actually the best at the tier with 22.5. So 25 is fine. It's not especially fantastic, it's not especially bad. It's just better than average. So yeah, that was one thing I saw that Flamu had picked up on, and I'm not entirely sure why. I don't think he'd actually compared the numbers to the other tier 6 cruisers. Maybe he had higher tier cruisers in mind, some of which do have rather better turret turn times. Although some of them don't, actually. The bigger gunned cruisers tend to have relatively poor turret traverse rates. So in that regard, this ship doesn't suffer a penalty for having big guns at all. And Wargaming possibly could have made that so, but it's kind of nice that they didn't, given that you're also already struggling with poor accuracy and a comparatively poor rate of fire. Firing 6 shells every 20 seconds, you know, you're maybe going to be struggling to do any substantial amounts of damage. And this game, by the way, up till this point, 20k damage, this was not unusual. I had games where I was able to manage better damage with my guns, and in fact the game that you're going to see, I do manage better damage with my guns alone. But, well, we're going to come to the torpedo armament in just a bit. So shell damage, a Citadel will get you 8400 with the AP. Switching between AP and HE, I found myself having to do that a lot. Angled battleships, you're going to need the HE, and it does have a whopping 20% fire chance, which is good. You know, this is a German cruiser with good fire chance, but it does have rather big shells, so it kind of makes sense that it would. The reload makes it awkward. Not going to lie, the reload makes it really awkward sometimes. You quite often just have to go with the shells that you have available, and then switch over in the next for the next lot. But against cruisers, AP definitely. Against broadside battleships, especially at this tier, I mean, bear in mind you've got better matchmaking than the Scharnhorst does. Yeah, it's definitely viable, the AP shells, but you get somebody like this at an angle, well, that went nowhere close. The HE shell is probably what you're going to be wanting. The speed is also fast. I think it's in fact the same as the Scharnhorst 11-inch gun. It's 910 meters a second. Initial velocity for both shell types, so you don't have to give that much lead, and that is one of the nicer things. I'm going to skip over the secondaries and the AA just to talk about the torpedoes, because that right there, that is your torpedo arc. That's another one of the outstanding things about this ship, is even though those rear-mounted torpedoes look like they should be super awkward, actually they've got an incredibly good range. So you can basically fire almost, not quite, you know, directly in front of your ship, but there's not that much of an arc in between. The torps are, in most regards, the same as on the Nuremberg, but they have better range. So it's the same damage, it's 13,700, but instead of 6 kilometers, you get 8 kilometers, and you also get an extra knot of speed. They are 65 knot torpedoes. So for that tier, they're actually pretty decent. The only other things that have torps, the only other cruisers that have torps that fast are the Budione and the Molotov, and they both have rather shorter ranges. So the torpedoes are really quite comfortable to use, and you've only got a minute and a half reload, which is not half bad. It's one of the better ones, actually. I think the Molotov has a better reload, and the Nuremberg has a better reload, but they both have shorter ranges. So the torpedoes are nice. Secondaries and the AA, well, the secondaries are rather substantial. You've actually got 3 twin turret 105 mils, which are also dual purpose AA guns, and you've also got 8 single 150 mil guns. These are all HE throwers, so it's rather substantial. The only other cruiser that I would say that comes kind of close is maybe the Cleveland with its 6 twin turret 127 mils. They're not especially great in terms of the range. You've got 4 kilometers on those, but there were times when they came in handy. And you'd rather have them than not, because it's bonus firepower, especially if you're having to deal with destroyers at closer range. Of course, you can also buff those in terms of their range with captain skills, but I don't know if there's equipment that lets you buff the range. There actually might be, come to think of it. But generally speaking, in that slot, you should be taking the equipment that boosts the accuracy of your main battery. Absolutely. I think that's a no-brainer on this ship. You could, take the thing that buffs your AA range, but you probably don't want to do that either, because you really do need that extra little bit of accuracy. The AA rating, on the face of it, not that remarkable. It's got a base rating of 33, which is the same as the Alba. You don't really think of the Alba as having good AA, but it's a little bit deceptive, and I've run the numbers slightly more in depth this time. So your max envelope is 4.5 kilometers, and it actually consists of those 105mm dual purpose guns. And because those are 105mm guns, if you're using the right captain skills, if you've got a German battleship captain with the manual AA focus, you've just doubled your outer envelope, which is a pretty substantial increase, because that's the best part of your DPS. So you go from 50 to 100 just as your outer envelope. I actually found the AA to be fairly decent. Now, that was with using defensive AA. You can, of course, use Hydro in that slot instead, and it's, of course, the rather good German Hydro. But I think you probably will, on balance, want to go with defensive AA, because although with that good captain, which I put in from my Turpits with manual AA, against same tier carriers, just on its own, it's a reasonable threat. And this is also with AFT and BFT. Well, against higher tier carriers, they're still not going to be that worried about you, so definitely defensive AA is my recommendation there. But yeah, it's kind of deceptive. You look at it and think 33, that's not that good. But with the right captain skills, suddenly it becomes actually pretty damn decent. Better than a lot of the other tier 6 cruisers. And because you have the better part of your DPS being on those long range guns, you actually get more benefit on this ship from manual AA than anything else other than the Cleveland. And the Cleveland with the manual AA skill just becomes insane. It really does. I was just looking through the numbers, and I think I ran it about 3 times for the Cleveland because it just looks so crazily good. And I thought, that can't be right. But no, with the Cleveland, with the manual AA, you control click somebody and suddenly you've got over 300 DPS. It's a bit mad. Well, if you've got, their planes over the maximum extent of your envelope, where you can use all your DPS rather than just the outer envelope. But even just the outer envelope, I mean, it's the same with the Cleveland. The bigger guns are your outer envelope, so you're basically doubling the DPS, and it jumps up to, I can't even remember offhand, but it goes up a lot. So the AA, don't discount it. It's actually pretty reasonable. It's better than it looks, but you need the right captain skills, and that brings me on to saying you're probably better off putting your German battleship captains in this generally than you are your German cruiser captains. At least that's my impression of it. I think the skills that benefit your battleship captains, even though this is a cruiser, will also benefit this thing more than a lot of the skills you would use on your cruisers. Maybe if you've got a high tier cruiser like the Rune or the Hindenburg, you might have the skills that would be useful. But Demo Expert in particular, 20%'s massively substantial already. Having an extra 3% on that, I mean, okay, yes, you can do, but it kind of feels like it might be overkill. It's one of these things that comes down to personal choice, really. I would go for things that buff your secondaries and your AA over skills that give you better fire chance. But on this ship anyway. But some people will want 23% over 20%, even though 20% is already pretty damn nuts. Speed, well, this is one of the areas where it's not so good. 28.5 knots, which for a cruiser is pretty slow. There are battleships that you can meet that will outpace you. You know, you meet Scharnhorst or Gneisenau, for instance, they're actually going to be able to overtake you. Pretty much all the cruisers you meet are going to be able to overtake you. If you ever have to chase down a destroyer, that's just going to be painful. So it is one of the areas where it falls down, and it's one of the things, I think, where you more have to adjust your playstyle when you're playing this than anything else. It's that speed. You can't really go gung-ho. You can't push forwards too far. Personally, I found being aggressive didn't work that well unless it was against, say, a single other cruiser, in which case your armor actually kind of works. But against multiple enemies, it's not going to work out that well. Against a battleship, you'd better be in company, you know, going one-on-one versus a battleship. In any Tier 6 cruiser, it would be incredibly risky, but in this, you know, that definitely is true. It probably isn't going to go well for you. Even the sort of Tier 5 battleship guns that you'll meet will probably be able to do a substantial amount of damage. So, although you do have that very good torpedo arc, which is going to come in useful on the off chance that you are trying to charge down a battleship, generally speaking, in a cruiser, that's not often a good idea. It's definitely not in this thing. Turn radius, 680 meters. Not especially great, but not especially bad for the tier. However, the rudder shift time is pretty terrible. 10.3 seconds. Absolutely, you want to take the rudder steering equipment. Rudder steering equipment? Yeah, that's exactly what it's called, yes. But that takes it down to about 8.5 seconds, something like that, which is still kind of sluggish, but it's better. Yeah, it's just the speed coupled with that rudder response, it really does feel very sluggish. And if I had to compare it to any other cruiser, I mean, we're talking just in terms of how it feels. It's more like the Budioni or the Alba, except with the worst rudder response, basically. So it's overall not a particularly nimble ship. It's not a particularly fast ship. And occasionally there are times when the battle might leave you behind, but it's not like you're playing a 21-knot battleship. You know, 28.5 knots is still not entirely terrible. It's just there are times when it will work against you. Lastly, detection. With the free premium camo that it comes with, because obviously it's a premium ship, you get 12.7 kilometers, which is, it's not great, but again, it's not especially horrible for its tier. It's towards the worst end of tier 6. The Cleveland has with camo, I'm gonna compare like with like here. The Cleveland with camo is 12.9. The Budioni with camo is 12.7, as is the Molotov. So 12.7's, it's not especially horrible, it's not especially great. You're not going to be stealthy in this thing, especially. If you put a concealment expert captain in, you can get it down to 11.1, or is it 11.2? I can't remember. Somebody said in one of their videos, and on my spreadsheet it says 11.1, but I could, well, just a little brief explanation. The camo values are almost certainly in 2 or more decimal places, but the client only shows 1 decimal place. So that's what I put in my spreadsheet, and I get out 11.1, but I think the actual figure displays as 11.2. So, there, anyway. Lastly, consumables that you can mount on this. Well, defensive AA and hydro go in the same slot. Hydro is going to be useful sometimes, but I think overall defensive AA more useful, as I've already said. You get a catapult fighter, and you've got a heal. And the heal is actually fairly handy because it's quite squashy. As I've said, this is not a particularly tough ship overall, so the ability to get a bit of health back, even if it's basically a cruiser heal, it's useful. And it will keep you in the game longer. And it's, a nice little boon on top of everything else that you've got going for you. Although there's also, you know, a lot of things that aren't going for you, as I've covered. So overall, it's an awkward ship, and I found adopting a more cautious playstyle a lot of the time meant I survived longer and was able to do more damage. But there are things that, even if you're doing everything right, will sometimes still trip you up. Like if a battleship decides you're going to die in a Tier 8 game, as with any Tier 6 cruiser, you're probably going to have a rough time of it. Or if you get into a close quarters fight with a destroyer, you might have a rough time of it. Or a close quarters battle fight with a battleship of any tier, you're probably going to have a rough time of it. So it's not going to be a ship for everybody. It's kind of like the Dunkirk in that regard. It's maybe more of a support ship than it is one where you can be taking control of the flow of battle. Let's put it that way. It's not like a Cleveland where you will potentially present a serious threat even to higher tier battleships. This is more of a keep chipping away at them and hope they'll give you broadsides for your AP shells kind of a ship. So yeah, I'm not going to just say, oh, it's a bad ship. I don't think that would be fair. I think it's an awkward ship, and I think it's a ship that some people will find really frustrating, and for other people, they will just love it. You know, just something about it will click with their play style, and they'll make it work, and they'll get really good damage results out of it, and make credits, because obviously, you know, it's a premium. Credits are ostensibly the name of the game. However, I do suspect that Wargaming are also, as with Prince Eugen, maybe playing on the famous name a bit, but this has more going for it than the Prince Eugen does. I mean, the Prince Eugen, one of the issues there was it's just a premium version of the Hipper, whereas this is something different and interesting and a bit more unique in play style than the Eugen. Because the Eugen didn't have anything special going for it in terms of its play style. This, however, it's different. And for some people, just the fact that it's different will be appealing. It gives them something new to try. So it's not bad. It's not a bad ship. But it's definitely not for everybody. So, yeah, I didn't really get to talk about the gameplay in either of those games. So that was a much better game damage-wise. Only one Citadel. I was struggling to do Citadels overall with this ship, to get those Citadels. But maybe I was just being, I don't know, not paying attention to the right targets at the right time, or just not getting cruisers that were showing broadsides. I've seen other people's reviews and watched other people's videos. It is entirely possible to punish people hard if they're sailing along, but you could do more than you can with this, or you could get those Citadels and get that damage more reliably in a Molotov is what I'm going for here in my very ham-fisted way. The accuracy and the power of those 7-inch Molotov guns makes it way more reliable. This is not a reliable damage dealer, I would say. It's one where you just have to keep plugging away at it and plugging away at it, and the damage can add up. And then sometimes you'll get those beautiful broadsides, just like a battleship, where the shells go exactly where you want them to, and it just stacks up really nicely. Lastly, as promised, before I wrap this up, we'll have a quick jog through the armour layout. And, well, as you can see, it's not particularly substantial, as I basically said. You've got the 100mm covering the lower part of the belt. This, by the way, is the torpedo bulge, so you can see how much it covers of the side of the ship there. It's basically fore and aft sections aren't protected. So if you take torpedoes there, obviously it's going to do more damage, but any torpedo hits amidships, you're going to be taking almost a quarter less from each torp. So, you know, that's not nothing. That's absolutely not nothing. The only thing to point out before we start stripping away is that the bridge, the conning tower, whatever, that kind of triangular structure, which is fairly distinctive, that is a rather tall part of the hitbox. So, I mean, it's not like, let's click on the Nürnberg, it's not like others don't have sticky up bits of hitbox, but I think it's maybe a little bit more substantial than it is on a lot of the other tier 6 cruisers. So that might be a problem sometimes. So we take away that side armour, and I'll take away the upper deck as well. And so that's the Citadel and the barbettes. The turrets themselves, 140mm on the turret face. The rest of the turret armour isn't actually that good, and the barbettes are only 125mm. So not especially substantial, but I actually didn't have many issues with turrets getting knocked out. And if you do end up with a turret knocked out, which of course can happen, it's going to be incredibly frustrating because you've only got 2 of them and it represents half your firepower. It's going to be like playing the Dunkirk or the Izumo, where you lose a turret and suddenly you are way less effective than you were before. I suspect, though, that the turrets themselves have a substantial number of hit points to compensate for this. Now, this is just pure speculation on my part, but unless I was getting horrendously lucky, which is possible, I just didn't really have issues with turrets getting knocked out. People whose videos I've watched already, they also haven't reported special problems with that as a mechanic, happening to them. So it can happen theoretically, but it might not happen too frequently. Hopefully, just the nature of the thing makes you hope it won't happen. So I'll take that away. Just leave the Citadel armor. It's not especially substantial. I mean, you've got the 100mm lower belt armor covering that up, of course, but there's no turtle deck. The end plates are only 100mm, and the outboard, no, that's not the right word. The extremities of the upper deck are only 70mm, so your protection against plunging fire is not particularly good. And even the upper armor on top of that, that's only 19mm. So plunging hits could be especially bad for you, but even just showing any broadsides to anybody is not going to go well. So yeah, the armor of this is not substantial, but it's a tier 6 cruiser essentially in its armor arrangement. None of the tier 6 cruisers have especially substantial armor. I think the best off overall is the Cleveland, and even though it's got smaller belt protection, 127mm, although that 100mm on the Graf Spee does cover a lot more of the side of the ship. And the Citadel deck is reasonably low in the water as well, so there's that. So anyway, would I buy it myself? Not necessarily. I mean, for some people it's just going to be that they're history fans. For other people it's going to be that they like the look of the ship. I mean, it's a very pretty ship. It's as I've said, not a bad ship, but it requires a particular play style. It requires a bit of caution, and occasionally you'll be able to be a bit more aggressive. But it's not your typical tier 6 HE spammer. It's not anything particularly like the 8-inch gun cruisers either. It's really its own thing, and for some people that's going to be attractive. But personally, yeah, I don't think I'll be plonking down money for this one myself. There are other ships I would much prefer to play that are going to be more fun for me to play. This one is a bit too much hard work to get a decent result out of it, in my personal opinion. But other people won't care about that. So there we go, that's the Graf Spee. An interesting addition to warships, to be sure, though it could, maybe do with a slightly faster reload, or maybe it would be more comfortable at tier 5, but this is what we've got. So perhaps buffs in future, maybe not. Time will tell if it needs them, of course. I'm sure Wargaming will be keeping an eye on the stats of this, as they do with all the new ships that are getting introduced. But for what it is right now, it's certainly not unplayable, far from it. So hopefully you found this first look interesting and useful, and if you have, you can hit the like button, you can leave any comments below, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.